And thank you to everybody who's here in the room and those of you who are online and participating. I'm really glad that all of you are here. So we're going to be looking at interpreted interviews with traumatized children. You are the experts on the interpreted part, but I have worked with interpreters in situations where children have been traumatized, particularly by child abuse and violence against women. And that book that you see there, Interviewing Clients Across Cultures, has a chapter on interviewing children from different cultures and has a chapter on working with interpreters as well that you might find interesting. I do want to say that I have not worked as an interpreter, although I have done interpreting, but I do work in different languages, Spanish and Portuguese, rather regularly. So I am eager to learn from you today as well. In the end, when we get to questions and answers and observations that you might have, I look forward to that. So what are our goals for our hour today, which is going to go by very quickly, I think? I'd like to convey what I think you need to know about trauma to interpret for children who have suffered trauma. So it's my assumption that many of you or most of you here either are interpreters or are hoping to be interpreters, and some of you undoubtedly also work with interpreters. I also hope we can explore together the special issues involved in interpreting for children as compared to adults who have suffered trauma. And then I'd like to briefly look at the emotional impact on the interpreter of working with children who have been traumatized. So it's an ambitious agenda for 1 hour. To define psychological trauma, it's a type of harm that occurs as a result of a severely distressing event. Now, we'll be looking at what some of those events are. It's worth noting that this same event will not affect two people in the same way. So one child who experiences the event, let's say a flood, we just had this big flooding in the Midwest. So let's say a flood, and they experience that flood in the arms of a parent who's able to protect them. And they don't see anybody being hurt with their own eyes. That will be a different experience than a child who perhaps was dragged away in water and was all by themselves, or who was clinging to a log all by themselves. So the trauma is different, and also people's responses are different because of their biology, and we don't entirely understand why that's true. Trauma results from an overwhelming amount of stress that exceeds the person's ability to cope or to integrate the emotions involved in that experience. So when a child has a traumatic experience, they're flooded with emotions, certainly fear, anger perhaps, confusion certainly, many feelings, and it's so overwhelming that they're not able to integrate all those feelings at the time. There are also physical aspects of trauma, and we're learning more and more about that, how stress hormones are elicited during the trauma, and therefore the person may end up experiencing those elevated hormone levels, cortisol levels throughout their lifetime, and how that can impact them physically. Traumas differ. A one-time trauma might be an automobile accident, can be absolutely terrible, but that's very different from a trauma that's repeated. I spoke recently with a woman who, for a week, her parents left her at her uncle's, and her uncle sexually abused her over a week period. So it was repeated trauma, but it wasn't a chronic trauma. So a chronic trauma would be something like growing up in a home where there's domestic violence and you're seeing that day after day after day, or an experience of child sexual abuse or child physical abuse over time that just occurs again and again and again. So those are different categories. Obviously, a chronic trauma is repeated, but by repeated there, I meant repeated but time limited, like the thing that happened during the one week. Traumas also differ in terms of their origins. So some are natural. I put the word natural in quotes because a lot of times things that humans have done can make the trauma worse. Deforestation in Haiti made the results of the earthquake much worse. But landslides are oftentimes worsened because of things that humans have done. So there are natural traumas, natural disasters, floods, storms, earthquakes. And then there are traumas that are inflicted with a benign intent. For instance, if a child goes into a medical setting and has a medical procedure, the intention was to heal the child, but for some reason there was trauma involved. Maybe the trauma was inevitable, maybe the trauma resulted from a medical mistake, but nevertheless, it was traumatic. Or what I'll call evil intent, which is different kinds of abuse or crimes against a child where the intention was to hurt that child. Traumas can be, we know that natural traumas where children, where it's a natural disaster, tend to be somewhat less impactful than harm that is inflicted by a human being. Maybe it has to do with how the child conceives of the world after a trauma that's inflicted by another person. So there are traumas that are inflicted by loved ones, which are very hard for children to assimilate. If a loved one beats them or sexually abuses them, it's very hard for them to handle the dependency on the adult with the harm inflicted by that adult. Then there are known people who are not loved ones. For instance, this could be a teacher, it could be a pastor, could be a Scouts leader or a coach who inflicts harm on a child, or it could be a stranger. The closer the person who inflicts the trauma, the more difficult it typically is for children to heal from it. There are group traumas and individual traumas. So a group trauma would be people who go through an event together. A terrorist incident in a school, horrible, horrible experience. The children are in it together. And we've seen the results of that recently, and unfortunately in some suicides by children who survived the Parkland school massacre. But they were in that together. That tends to be somewhat easier to recover from, and these are generalizations, than a trauma that a child experiences individually, alone, has no one to talk to about it, no one to process it with. And unfortunately, those are also very common. So we have different kinds of trauma. And then we have children who witness trauma. So for instance, they witness somebody being killed in an accident, or witness somebody being beaten or hurt, or witness somebody dying, a traumatic death, or things they've experienced directly. And that also determines how they'll respond. Traumas are pretty common. If you think about yourself and people you know, 2/3 of children experience at least one trauma. And here are some kinds of trauma: psychological, physical, or sexual abuse, community or school violence, exposure to intimate partner violence or domestic violence, natural disasters or terrorism, medical traumas, the loss of a parent or the injury of a parent, severe neglect, accidents, and many other things that could happen that I'm sure we could come up with together. However, so experiencing one trauma is pretty common in children's life. The more traumas a child experiences, the more difficult it is to integrate those experiences. And in general, the worse the outcome is, although some children are amazingly resilient and have a lot of resources despite all the traumas that they face. So why do we think it's important to train interpreters in child trauma? Now, a good interpreter probably wouldn't do any of those things, but let me just make the case of why it's important for interpreters to know about child trauma. An interpreter who doesn't know about child trauma might be emotionally insensitive. The interpreters I've worked with have been largely in community settings which were underfunded. So they weren't, in some cases they were professional interpreters, in some cases they were people who were taking the role of interpreters who were not adequately trained. So I've seen these things, even if all of you who are here say you would never do these things, but I think it's important to mention them. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings though, or get you on the defense about it. So the interpreter might be emotionally insensitive, might tell a weeping child not to get upset, might not understand the emotional response of a child. A child might laugh. They might seem sort of frozen emotionally. They could be talking about very painful content, but not giving the emotional response that a person not trained in trauma would expect. They might be in denial. They might tell a child to stop lying, for instance. Your father would never do those things you're accusing him of doing. That would be one form of denial, because it's really very hard to believe how evil people can be if that's not the field you're in. An interpreter might, clean up the child's language. For instance, if the child or teenager uses curse words or quote unquote dirty words, they might try to clean them up and use technical words. They might not use the baby talk that the child uses when they're interpreting it. If the child says incoherent phrases or talks about sexual matters, I've been in situations where an interpreter interpreting a child sexual abuse interview really didn't know what they were getting into. And when the sexual part happened, the interpreter said, I can't say those things. Now, obviously, those things are the things that most need to be interpreted. At least in that case, the interpreter said they weren't going to say them, so we could intervene. But it could be a situation where if you don't understand the language the child's speaking and the interpreter simply doesn't interpret the sexual parts, that would be very, very problematic. An interpreter who doesn't understand trauma might try to overprotect the child. So failing to convey certain questions or certain statements because they think they'll be upsetting to the child. The interpreter might try to take control. For instance, the child asks a question, the interpreter might respond to the child's question, trying to be helpful, rather than conveying the question to the interviewer, which of course is what should happen. An interpreter who isn't trained in trauma might fail to convey a comment or a question. So for instance, if the interviewer asks a specific question, the interpreter might think that's not a good question, that's not an appropriate question, that's not a question you would ask a child, and therefore not convey it. You could imagine, for instance, if the interviewer, depending on the interview, asks about suicide, have you thought about killing yourself? An interpreter might think, oh, I can't ask that. In other words, injecting their own ideas into the session. An interpreter might argue with or shame a victim if they're talking about things that the interpreter, let's say, doesn't believe have happened. They might try to convince a victim to retract statements. I was in a situation where the interpreter told the child who was disclosing sexual abuse by an uncle, why don't you just say it was physical abuse? You'll still get out of his house and he won't get into as much trouble. Clearly not what they should be doing. An interpreter who doesn't understand trauma might be more likely to fail to maintain confidentiality. These interviews are upsetting. And so they may talk to people about them either to gossip, which obviously is not professional, or just to try to get some support around it. You're not going to believe what I heard today, which again, obviously is not appropriate. They might criticize the victim for revealing information. I've seen that as well, when the interpreter comes from the same small ethnic community as the child and they think that they're making the group look bad by talking about, let's say, violence in the family. Then they might scold the child for talking about these sensitive matters. They might interrupt something that's going on to try to intervene with the child, to protect the child, or to change something the child's doing, to change the course of the interview. Just briefly, I'm going to talk about some of the symptoms of child trauma. One symptom is traumatic arousal, and not all children have all these symptoms. So that could be difficulty sitting still, hypervigilance, which is always looking for signs of danger. Sometimes kids don't want to sit with it, or adults even don't want to sit with anybody behind them because they're afraid. They want to be able to scan the room at all times. Children who startle easily, maybe you reach to put a hand on their arm or there's a loud noise and they jump. Emotional numbness. A lot of times children who've experienced trauma, particularly a chronic trauma, seem very numb to what's going on around them, difficult to reach. They may have intrusive memories, which we also call flashbacks. So at times when they're not wanting to remember what happened, those memories come unbidden. Maybe there's a sound or a smell or a story or something that reminds them, that triggers the memory. And that can be very, very difficult. They may have a low tolerance for stress and either burst into tears or get very angry when they're stressed. They may experience depression, certainly a very common symptom in people who've been traumatized. They may experience anxiety. This can come out in all different kinds of ways. So a child who's been traumatized may become afraid of the dark. They may become afraid of water. They may become afraid of going into public places, afraid of elevators, all different, afraid of touch, afraid of not being touched. You know, it can manifest in all different kinds of ways. They may experience anger or rage, outbursts that seem unexplained. Unfortunately, a lot of times people don't understand that the child has experienced trauma. So they see a child who's very angry, maybe has these outbursts, and they think that's a bad kid. That kid needs to control their temper, and they respond punitively when really the child needs someone to help them understand what's happened to them. And often children experience disturbed bodily function, so difficulty sleeping, either eating too much or not eating, or developing, you know, kind of odd food things about only eating white foods or only eating hard foods or soft foods or things of that kind. Difficulties with toileting, and even moving in odd ways you might see in a child who's been traumatized. And the context in which you would interpret with a child who's been traumatized would also vary. So is it a crisis situation or not a crisis situation? You know, if you're in a refugee camp or in a school after shooting, that would be a crisis situation. But if it's, let's say, you know, long-term psychotherapy, that would be a non-crisis situation, and that would also affect your role in what you do. Is it ongoing or a one-time contact? So are you going to be interpreting every week for 12 weeks as this child participates in group therapy? Or are you going in for a one-time forensic interview? Those, you know, have implications for the kind of relationship you'd want to have with the child. What are the goals of the interview? Is it an investigation? Maybe a police investigation? A social work investigation? Those are different. If it's a forensic investigation for court, then there are real strict guidelines in what you can say and not say, and how you can say it and not say it. And I'll give you a link later to a video that I did on interpreting forensic interviews. Is it an evaluation? So maybe you're helping with a psychological evaluation or assessment of the child. Is it a medical? And if it's a psychological assessment, then again, how you phrase things might be really important. But it's also important to know that psychological assessments through an interpreter are not accurate. The person doing that needs to know that they can't just use the numbers as they would with a person who is speaking English. Is it medical? Is it for psychotherapy? What are the goals of the conversation? That would be important for you to know. Is it time sensitive? Does this child need to, you know, get into care that evening or something? Do they need to be, are they in the emergency room? I mean, those would obviously create a big rush to get through the conversation accurately. In terms of the adult in the room, the professional, are you interpreting for someone who works with children often? Well, that person you can interpret, they probably are using child-friendly words, and those are the words you can use. But if you're working with somebody who doesn't work with children often, so let's say you're interpreting for a police officer who's not used to interviewing children, but is used to interviewing suspects, they may be using a lot of words that the child doesn't understand. My suggestion would be that you would, but Chris and others can correct me if this is not appropriate, my suggestion would be that you would talk with that person and say, I'm going to use simpler words with the child that they are more likely to understand. Is that okay? And check with them, because if you're simply using the words that they're using, you know, imputed and identity and things that are beyond a child's grasp, then the child won't understand the conversation. And then are you interpreting with somebody who's used to working with an interpreter? If they're not used to working with an interpreter, then you may want to give them help in understanding how interpreted conversations go. Whether you're doing turn taking, short utterances, Speak loudly so I can hear, those kinds of instructions. Children also vary. How old is the child? That will give you some idea of the kinds of words that you can use. Do they have any developmental issues? A 10-year-old who has developmental delays might be more like a 4-year-old or not. In some ways, yes, in some ways, no. So it would be important to know if those issues are present. How fluent are they in the languages that are present? So if it's English and Spanish, get a sense of the fluency in each language. And of course, I hope this goes without saying, but always important to check that the language that you've been summoned to speak is indeed the language the child speaks. So if a child comes in from Ecuador and you're all prepared to do a Spanish language interpretation, but their language is actually Quechua, then you're not going to get very far. Or if they're Mexican and they speak a Mayan language and you're ready to interpret in Spanish. So that is important to check as well. Children vary in their vocabulary. We know that parents speak a lot to some children and other parents don't speak so much to their children. So children have different vocabularies, also depending on what kind of school setting they might be in. Their cultures vary. So is this a child who adults talk to a lot? Or is this a child who's unaccustomed to speaking with adults? That may change how they speak as well. What is their gender? How comfortable are they with the context and its demands? If there are microphones, if there are hidden cameras, all those kinds of things will influence whether a child, how comfortable they are speaking. Children who are used to using interpreters will probably get it quicker, get the process, than a child who's never worked with an interpreter and doesn't understand what's happening. So the bottom line in terms of that is to tune into the child who's in front of you and make adjustments. What you did with a 10-year-old child who spoke the same language last week is not going to be the same as what you do with the 10-year-old child you see this week. It depends on all of these factors. I think it's important to ask yourself if you're the right interpreter. Do you have documented competency in the target language, the dialect, and English? And forgive me again if you're a professional interpreter and this all sounds very obvious, but sometimes somebody has documented competency in Russian and they're interpreting in Polish because they speak a little Polish. Maybe you're not the right interpreter for that situation. Are you sensitive interpersonally? The child, you've learned that this interview is going to be about child sexual abuse. Is that something that you feel like you can handle? My plea for interpreters would be to become more comfortable talking about a range of subjects. Learn more, read, educate yourselves, take psychology classes, take classes on violence, volunteer at the local shelter if you can, rather than saying, no, I won't handle any cases that have X. If that's your position, then you could be in trouble because you could be called in to interpret for a child who's about to have surgery, and then somehow they also disclose that they've been sexually abused in that conversation. And then what do? Say, oh no, I can't handle this, and you walk out? I mean, that in and of itself would be traumatizing and unprofessional. Do you have knowledge of cultural issues? It's great, of course, to understand the language, but you also should try to become fluent in the cultures of the people that you're interpreting for as much as you can. And are you knowledgeable about working with children? There are many ways to become knowledgeable about working with children. I do have a chapter in that book, Interviewing Clients Across Cultures, on interpreting with children, and there's some material available on the web as well. So I don't know if most interpreters or some interpreters have pre-session meetings, but I think it would be a good idea to do if you can before the interview. Some of the questions that you might want to find out about, and hopefully they would tell you, is like, what's the interview about? It would be a shame to come in and find out that the interview was about a particular medical procedure that you didn't have the vocabulary for, or to be unprepared to find out that the child had witnessed a murder. You'd rather not burst into tears or be shocked in the interview. So getting some kind of heads up about what the topic is helpful. Do they expect any complications? They know the child has perhaps a speaking impediment or some kind of developmental disability. Is there anything you want to tell me about the child? Might be helpful beforehand. So what are some of the special issues that come up in interpreting for children? The interviews and the conversations may take longer than with adults. There may be more orienting that you need to do, more explaining of words and terms, more kind of background. Children have smaller vocabularies than adults. So that we hope would affect the person doing the interview, that they would be choosing child-friendly words. But certainly as an interpreter, you're not going to want to raise the level of the language used and use adult words or more adult words. And that can be challenging. Um, if you're not sure how to explain something, you could ask the person who asks the question, can you say that in a way a child could understand? So you could ask them to do that, and probably should. Children have an easier time understanding shorter and less complex sentences. So you're interpreting what the person said, but we do make choices when we interpret. So if you have the choice to break things into smaller sentences that will be easier for the child to grasp, then that's going to be a good idea. Children may be intimidated by you physically, and this is something to keep in mind, particularly for people who are large, particularly for men, that you may not feel yourself to be intimidating, and adults might not find you intimidating, but just your physical presence may be intimidating to a child. So you probably want to get down to the child's level. You'll have to work out seating with the person who's doing the interview, and try to make yourself less intimidating. A lot of times young children believe that they are speaking for the interpreter's ears, and the voice they hear is the interpreter's. So they may feel very connected to the interpreter, especially a young child. Older children often very quickly forget that the interpreter is there. If the interpreter is off to the side interpreting, but young children may feel very connected to the interpreter. Oftentimes interpreters come from the same culture as the children as well, which might increase that feeling. Some other special issues in interpreting for children. Children's language abilities are uneven. So a child might be able to speak very well about certain topics and not others. They may have a big vocabulary for, let's say, medical stuff because their mom is a nurse. And so they can talk about shifts, and they can talk about operations, and they can talk about all these things, but then they may completely lack vocabulary in other areas. They may know certain terms only in one language. So it's very common for children in the US who go to school in the US to have English terms for things that happen in school, chalkboard and desk and ruler and things of that kind, and may not know them in their native languages. On the other hand, they may have words for bodies, for family members, body parts, things that happen in the home. They may have those words only in the language that's used at home. So that can be complicated for an interpreter. A lot of times children will look more acculturated than they are, especially teenagers. So, within a week of arriving in the US, they may wear their jeans the way people here do, and their sneakers, and, slouch and so on the way people do. And so you may expect them to have English language skills that they don't have, or to have sort of an understanding of what's going on that they really don't have yet because they're recently arrived. Children are apt to be ashamed and embarrassed of all kinds of things. They're often ashamed of needing an interpreter. They're embarrassed about not knowing words. If they're asked things in an interview, they may be embarrassed about not knowing those things, feeling like they should know. If they're asked about sexual matters, they may find that very embarrassing as well. Children tire easily. The act of going through a conversation for a small child, they have a shorter ability to endure, and it varies with the child certainly, but a lot of times these interviews have to go, they just can't go on and on, or hopefully the interviewer has some skills in allowing the child to take a break and then return if that's necessary. Sometimes children just act uncooperative. They just say no, they don't answer, they shake their heads, they won't engage in any way. And you might find that frustrating. You might find yourself even getting angry at the child for not participating. But it's important to know that there could be a whole range of reasons why they are not cooperating. They may have been told by an adult not to say anything. They may have been threatened not to say anything. They may not actually speak the languages that they're being, that are being used. There just could be a lot of, they have other things on their mind. Maybe what they're being interviewed about is not the worst thing that's happened, and they really want to talk about something else, but they've been told not to. And sometimes children are simply unwilling to speak. After a session, if you can, I recommend that you speak alone with a professional about any doubts you might have about the quality of the interpretation. If there's reason that you don't think it was a good interpretation, or there were problems, you had trouble understanding the child, they were using vocabulary you weren't familiar with, they didn't seem to understand what you were saying, it's important to convey that. Any other concerns that you have. And then I want to spend a little time looking at the effects on the interpreter of interviewing children about traumatic situations. In general, children arouse feelings in adults who have empathy, which I assume all of you do. So children make us feel protective. We don't want them to be upset. We don't want them to be upset by the things that are being talked about in the interview. Sometimes we have the impulse to just, take them home and protect them. They may make us feel angry. We may feel angry at the child, or we may feel angry at somebody who's done something to the child that's so wrong. And those feelings can come up in us. And it's important not to show them to the child, because children, particularly children who've been abused, are very good at reading us, very good at reading our signs. And if they think that they're upsetting you, then they're going to stop talking. If they think you can't handle it, they're going to stop talking. I've seen situations where the child was doing fine in an interview and the interpreter burst into tears, and that ended the interview. So, and it could, if it was a legal case, it could also ruin the case. So it's important you can have all the feelings you want after the interview, but not in the room at the time. Just take note. You can take note to yourself. Oh, I'm beginning to feel angry, but that's not the time or the place to express them. You might feel heartbroken about some things you learned. They might just feel impossible. You may be in a situation of denial. This didn't happen. This couldn't have happened. It's not the way it happened. It's not. Maybe you were there, or or somebody participated in something similar, and it doesn't feel believable to you. It's important to interpret. It's not about your belief. It's just important to convey what is said, and then let the people whose job it is to figure out what happened. Sometimes people who are interpreting have been through similar things, and they minimize the seriousness of what the child is expressing. It's important not to, just convey it. Okay, so you're feeling strong feelings in the interview. Try to set them aside so your voice can be clear and not choked up with emotion. And as I said, handle it afterwards. What are you going to do if children reach out to you for comfort? They want a hug. They want to sit on your lap. They want to cry in your arms. It's worth thinking about that, because that does happen. A lot of what I've learned about interpreting, I've been helped greatly by a good friend of mine, Ilia Kornier, who's a court interpreter and trains court interpreters in Massachusetts. And here's something she told me about. She described interpreting in court for a young child, Billy, who had been brutally assaulted. That's not his real name. She asked Billy where he wanted her to sit when he testified. He asked her to climb up into the witness box with him. By the end of his testimony, he had crawled into her lap for security, and the judge was fine with it. The judge understood that this was what he needed. But you have to think about that. That's not going to happen with an adult who you're interpreting for, right? But it might happen with a child. So give some thought to what you do, or what you would do or should do to debrief emotionally. If you're in a situation with psychotherapist or social worker, it's very likely that everybody else in the room has been trained in how to handle trauma. They've taken courses on trauma. They may do burnout prevention. It's probably not adequate, but at least they're familiar with the issues. They're probably part of a team. So after that difficult interview, they talk to each other. They debrief with each other. Oh my gosh, this interview that I had, they probably have some supervision around the trauma. But what about you? What about the interpreter? What has the interpreter got to help them cope with that difficult experience of the interview? I want to give you another quote from Ilya. She talked about the worst time she interpreted a traumatic incident. The worst time for me was when I was interpreting the victim impact statement of a sadistic rape. The young girl read page after page about how awful her life had been since the rape. She was weeping while she was reading the statement, and I was repeating everything, speaking in the first person and using the word I as if it had happened to me. I was trying to put emphasis where she put emphasis and convey in my speech as much as I could the feelings she was conveying. At the end, the court took a recess and I went to the bathroom, splashed water on my face, and I was supposed to walk right into the next courtroom and begin working in the next case. I was shaking like a leaf. I don't think that I can tell there's enough written about the emotional impact of interpreting. About you're listening to difficult material, yes, but you're also repeating it using the word I. You may be interpreting for an offender and using the word I for the offender's voice as well, and that's a really difficult experience. I hope that people who do that kind of interpreting work in teams and can help each other process, even if it's an informal once a week lunch or something, and obviously in a private place, you're not going to talk about things in a restaurant, but so you can support each other. So I'm drawing to an end here, and I'm eager for your questions. I want to thank you for your commitment to quality interpreting with traumatized children so that every child can be heard, understood, and respected and receive the best possible professional response. I have some resources here for you. This is the video that I mentioned earlier. It's about 30 minutes. It's on tips for foreign language interpreters in forensic interviews. So it's got more than we talked about today, specifically about forensic interviews with children, for instance, at child advocacy centers. And here are some other resources. I don't know if you're familiar with Bridging Refugees, Youth and Children's Services, has a lot of materials in many languages on children and trauma, children and child abuse, children in schools. And if you're going to be interpreting for a child from a particular country that you may be less familiar with, you can go there and find out a lot of wonderful information. The National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project also has materials on trauma and families from different cultures. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network is also another wonderful resource, and trauma-sensitive schools. There's a movement to make schools trauma-sensitive. And I looked for materials on trauma-sensitive interpreting. I didn't see them. I know there's people who are doing it. I know, I read about different interpreting centers around the country that are doing that, but they really haven't produced materials that I could find. So I'm eager for your comments, questions, observations. Thank you.